Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for today's HITRUST webinar, HITRUST 101, an introduction to HITRUST assessments. I'm Josh Bantz, principal at McKonly Asbury in our SOC practice, technology, consulting, and HITRUST group. I have over 20 years experience performing pre-assessment services, IT consulting services, and IT assurance services over a wide variety of industries. Joining me today will be Chris Fieger, a supervisor with McKonly Asbury. Want to introduce yourself, Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. So I'm Chris Fieger, a supervisor at McKonly Asbury in our SOC and technology HITRUST consulting practice, and I have several years of experience performing SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3 engagements, as well as HITRUST.
Great, Chris. For those of you who don't know, McKonly Asbury is an accounting and business advisory services firm with offices in Camp Hill, Lancaster, Bloomsburg, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We provide a wide range of services to organizations across a variety of industries, as you can see on the screen, and we encourage you to visit our website to learn more. If you have joined us for our past webinars, welcome back. If you haven't, our monthly webinars feature various business topics to keep you updated on what's going on around us and in our market. Be sure to check out our website to catch past presentations as well as current information through our various blogs. If you have any questions during today's presentation, please submit them through the built-in questions function. We have various CPE questions that will pop up during the period, and you must answer the CPE questions to qualify for CPE. The first one has popped up. Please keep in mind that those questions will be presented throughout the presentation, and you'll need to answer every one of those questions or you will not receive your certificate via email.
Okay.
All right, great. So let's go over the agenda for today's HITRUST webinar. The couple of aspects that we would like to hit on today, given that this is an introductory webinar, I would expect that some of our attendees in the audience will have some levels of experience and varying levels of experience with HITRUST assessments. Those of you may have actually participated in some testing or been through a HITRUST assessment with your organization. Others of you may have heard of HITRUST through your organizations that you work with. And then there's likely various individuals who have no idea what HITRUST is, and this will be a complete introduction. Given that this is a HITRUST 101 webinar, this will be a very high-level introduction to provide you baseline understanding of some various concepts of HITRUST and hopefully allow you to leave after this hour with a little further understanding of the history and what HITRUST is, what the common security framework that HITRUST has introduced is, the types of HITRUST assessments that an organization may go through. What does the timeline look like for a HITRUST assessment? What is the HITRUST reporting process? And then lastly, what are the benefits of a HITRUST assessment? We are open to questions throughout the webinar. Please feel free to submit them via the GoToMeeting chat. We'll try to answer most of the questions at the end of the webinar. However, continue to include those questions as the various slides and topics are being gone through. We're happy to go through those at the end in a little question and answer session that we have set up at the end. So what is HITRUST? So the official name of HITRUST is the Health Information Trust Alliance. It was formed in 2007. This is an actual organization, a corporation that was set up. And as you can see in the name, Healthcare Information Trust Alliance, it was initially set up to provide an information security focus for the healthcare industry to effectively manage data, information risks, and compliance for healthcare organizations. As most of us know that are either in healthcare or in the information technology field, healthcare has typically been a very highly regulated area with varying HIPAA requirements and so forth, with privacy of data, security of data. So this organization was created in 2007 to help develop a compliance framework and assessment to help the healthcare industry focus on how to further meet compliance standards within the healthcare industry. That was their official mission. The evolution of HITRUST. HITRUST has moved far beyond the healthcare industry and is now a widely adopted framework that touches many, many industries. The way HITRUST has established their security framework for their information security controls is it's a very flexible framework that incorporates many regulatory requirements. So it allows organizations to truly work through a baseline information security and privacy controls, but it also allows organizations to layer additional regulatory requirements, which provide additional controls to the framework. So it's a highly and very flexible framework that provides a defined set of controls that can be modified based upon a specific organization's industries that it's working in. Given that evolution, you can see HITRUST be well beyond the healthcare industry into governmental, service providers, various other industries. What is HITRUST? So the official definition of HITRUST comes from the HITRUST Alliance is a comprehensive, flexible, and efficient approach to compliance and risk management that has been adopted on a global scale. As Chris and I would probably say, that is a very complex set of definition with a lot of words. What is the real plain English definition of HITRUST? HITRUST is a information security and privacy framework that is built upon many frameworks. We kind of call it a framework of frameworks. It's organizations who access, store, exchange sensitive information can use the HITRUST framework as a roadmap to ensure data and security compliance. The HITRUST framework and HITRUST is built upon the ISO 27001 and 27002 standard, as well as there's 40 other security and privacy related regulation standards and frameworks built into the HITRUST security framework. So in reality, HITRUST has gone out as they've developed their information security controls and privacy controls that are required to be met as part of their framework, and they've gone out to many other regulatory requirements such as NIST, FISMA, HIPAA, and they've developed and built a framework that can pull those together that is very modifiable for each organization. So as an organization's evaluating their ability to comply with the security requirements of HITRUST, they also have the ability to say that they work across multiple industries and in multiple locations, so they may have additional regulatory requirements that they're expected to meet based upon location and industry. And HITRUST allows for that to be built into the assessment. So really what it is it is a truly a framework that is built upon over 40 other frameworks to be able to meet information and privacy security.
Exactly.
So now we've come to polling question 2. What prompted you to attend this webinar? I'm interested in learning more about HITRUST. I love McKonly Asbury webinars, or I'm here for CPE credit. I'm going to keep the poll open for a little bit longer.
Great. So yeah, it looks like we have kind of a spread out group here with a lot of individuals interested in HITRUST, and then some that are looking for CPE credit, and then a decent group that just loves M&A webinars. So I'd like to see that.
Absolutely.
Okay, so yeah, as Josh got into kind of the history of HITRUST and just the general overview of all the frameworks that it involves, the actual common security framework is the framework that HITRUST uses that is actually composed of all of those different frameworks, such as ISO and NIST. And as Josh said, the HITRUST, this common security framework, is essentially a framework of frameworks. It merges controls and standards from ISO, NIST, and other frameworks to create a compliance and risk-driven system. And it quantitatively evaluates compliance with security and privacy controls. Those are the two main focuses of HITRUST. And it also supports the HITRUST CSF assessment certification process, which we'll get into in a little bit more detail later on in the presentation. And one tool that HITRUST actually provides to organizations that are looking to go into this assessment certification is MyCSF. So there are definitely tools out there to help in becoming certified.
And Chris, just to expound on that, it states here that it quantitatively evaluates compliance with controls. Can you detail that a little bit further? Just because I think that's an interesting concept. We tend to look at quantitative items as well as qualitative items, and most of the work that we do is information security consultants and assurance providers. So
sure thing. So quantitatively, HITRUST is actually designed off of a scoring system. So we'll touch on that a little bit later on in the presentation, but there's actually scoring that is involved for each of the requirement statements, each of the controls. So you actually at the end of the certification process, you receive a score based on each of the different domains, and that determines whether you receive a certification or not.
Great, that makes perfect sense.
Okay, so just getting into some common security framework definitions. These are just HITRUST general terms that we just wanted to provide to you all just to kind of help explain some of the terminology as we're going through the presentation. You can see here that there's control categories, control objective, control references, implementation levels, requirement statements, which we'll touch on in a little more detail, and then the domains. And the three that we want to touch on in more detail are the control references. There's, depending on what certification and assessment you're looking for, there can be a maximum of 156 control references. Requirement statements can be a maximum of 1,900. And the domains, those are always going to be the 19. And these are essentially the groups of like controls that are used to score during the assessment. And the scoring is actually based on, depending on which certification you're looking to get, the maturity level is also involved, depending on whether it's policy, process, implemented, measured, and managed. And those are the different levels based on the assessment type that you're looking to go down.
One of the things that I would like to touch on this slide is that these definitions will come up throughout the rest of our presentation.
Yes,
I don't want to keep telling everybody to refer themselves back to this slide, but one of the things that I think Chris and I have found as we've been sort of extensively trained through HITRUST and our experiences with HITRUST is these HITRUST definitions are in some ways unique to the HITRUST Common Security Framework, the CSF. So as you read and may say what a domain is, you may know what a control reference is. These definitions are very unique and clearly defined just for HITRUST. So it's good to have an understanding of that component of it, because the HITRUST Common Security Framework is configured to be broken into many different buckets, so to speak. There's 19 domains. There's 156 control references, Chris, as we know, but those control references cross many domains. The domains are more defined into what you would typically see in operations of an IT environment, things like access control, password management, things like that, whereas the control reference may touch, a specific set of control references, and control objectives may touch multiple domains. So there's many ways to cut up the requirements that are needed to meet the Common Security Framework. But it is something to just kind of point out that these definitions were in here really early in our presentation, because we will be referencing these specific terms as we go through. So it's just something I wanted to point out as we were going through this presentation. So
yeah, that's perfect. Okay, so going more into the design, I know we kind of touched on the control references, requirement statements, and we're going to add a new term, elements, to this next slide. So when HITRUST developed this, they made it so that each requirement statement has various elements. So based on the implementation level, there may be certain areas that you'll need to meet within that requirement statement, and those would be called elements. So a control reference may have multiple requirement statements, and then a requirement statement may have multiple elements. And just kind of getting into the scoring process just a bit, the scoring is actually first going to be done by the client, and then it's going to be evaluated by the external assessor if you're going down the route of a validated or certified assessment. And on this slide, we just wanted to provide a brief example. So the first, you can see the domain, O1 Information Protection Program. There's just an example control reference, as Josh had mentioned. There's different security criteria that are called out in each reference. And then the requirement statement, this one is specifically made up of 4 elements. So when we get into the scoring, each of these elements would be scored when trying to determine whether the organization would be certified.
That's correct, Chris. And one of the things we kind of say as we look at that requirement statement, the requirement statements, and correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, are exactly what are supposed to be implemented and being performed by, to meet each of the individual aspects of the common security framework. So there's actually, those requirement statements have 4 elements to them in this example, and it is expected that an organization would be doing all 4 of these things as it relates to the senior level information security officer. Am I correct?
Yes, yeah, exactly. Essentially, a requirement statement can be interchangeably used with the term control. So it's essentially a requirement statement is actually exactly the same as a control. Control references are kind of those categories, and then domains are actually the highest level category when you look at HITRUST.
That's a great analogy as you go through this, as we talked about the unique vocabulary and definitions that HITRUST has established as part of their common security framework. It was actually a great analogy to say that think of a requirement statement as an actual control and what has to be met to be meeting the objectives of the control reference in that specific domain.
Okay, and then yes, you can kind of see on this slide about the various domains. These are kind of ranging from access control, mobile device security, network protection, and physical environmental security. These would be all of the domains for a HITRUST assessment.
And within each of these domains, Chris, there is a set of requirement statements that are required to be met. And within those requirement statements, each requirement statement has a set of elements that may be met, that are required to be met. So trying to kind of, I think Chris and I are sitting here trying to put together the structure as best we possibly can to explain it via a webinar. But the reality is that, each of these domains has a series of requirement statements, and those requirement statements also incorporate a set of elements so that it's very, very clear what you're expected to be scored on. And they're scored by domain. So
yes, yeah, exactly. Okay, so touching on the HITRUST assessment object, getting more into detail on the assessment, there's some stages that you can go through for HITRUST. The first one is the readiness assessment, which is a good way to define your scope, identify any gaps, because there may be some requirement statements or elements that aren't being implemented just when you're just starting down the HITRUST journey. And also corrective action plans. So these we'll get into a little bit more detail, but they would be also something you can identify during the readiness assessment. Defining the scope, this can vary based on clients, including the locations, data, the operating systems that the organization is using. And then based on the scope and risk factors, the requirement statements would be generated to actually create the assessment for scoring. Now, just one item to note, HITRUST only certifies implemented systems, so it wouldn't certify facilities, people, services, or products.
That's correct, Chris. It's an interesting conceptualization that the assessment object is really to be an implemented system. Within that system, you can have within scope specific facilities, you can have specific applications within scope. And that's also part of the scoping process when you go through an assessment is identifying the applications you're using, operating systems, the databases that you're using, and so forth. But it is one thing to note that they do not certify those specific things listed there. They don't certify. They also don't people, facilities, services, or a specific product.
Yeah, because all of those items could be functioning in a system, but they only would certify the specific system in place.
That's correct.
Okay, so we've come to our third polling question. The poll should be showing up on the screen. How familiar are you with HITRUST? Are you very familiar, somewhat familiar, or not familiar with at all? We'll give it another couple seconds.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Well, it looks like everyone is either somewhat familiar or not familiar at all. So we're glad to have you on the presentation and hope so far it's been educational for you.
Absolutely. As I said earlier, I thought there may have been some people on the call who had been through some HITRUST assessments, but obviously after seeing this, it's fairly clear that there's some folks that have heard of HITRUST and are somewhat familiar, but we apparently do not have any experts out there listening, which is, given it's an introductory type of webinar, that's probably good. All right, so the next topic we want to talk about is HITRUST assessments. So as we've discussed in the last two sections that we have gone over, we've really been trying to hit on the background of what HITRUST is, what the purpose, mission, and how that's evolved into what the organization and what HITRUST security controls are today, into what the HITRUST Common Security Framework is, the CSF, which is the actual set of controls built on all the frameworks that are required to be met. So now we want to dive a little bit into a HITRUST assessment. And what a HITRUST assessment really is an organization is going to assess its compliance with the Common Security Framework that Chris just kind of went over in the last set of slides. And what that's, the objective there is you want to assess yourself, and we talked about the quantitative aspect of it, and you actually assess yourself on each requirement statement, which filter up to the control references into the domains by by score. You're actually scored in your compliance in 0 through 100 with each of those requirement statements. So when we start talking about what the assessment is, truly the assessment is evaluating your organization's compliance with the specific aspects of the Common Security Framework. So there's a couple different aspects to a HITRUST assessment. Obviously, Chris talked a little bit about before, but a readiness assessment. HITRUST provides for a readiness assessment, which allows you to go through and evaluate your organization's score your organization's readiness with the specific each specific domain, control reference, and requirement statements, without necessarily having to go in and test, but you're providing yourself a score, because one of the things that you'll find, and we'll get into this later in the assessments, is how the actual scoring works for HITRUST. It is quantitative, so there's scoring thresholds you have to meet. So by doing a readiness assessment, effectively what it allows you to do is go through and score yourself against each of the requirement statements without necessarily doing the full sampling and full testing that needs to be done for each control, but to do an assessment of where you believe you're at, and then it provides a score by domain and by control references, which allows you to identify gaps. You can identify gaps at control reference levels, at domain levels, as well as specific requirement statements that actually may have a specific gap because you're not meeting that requirement statement. So what that really allows you to do is assess where your organization is at before you actually truly kick off a full assessment with HITRUST, so that you have a path forward to continue your organization down through the steps of maturing through getting all the aspects of the HITRUST Common Security Framework implemented and working. So so the readiness assessment, and then the next we also have validated/certified, which this is an interesting concept, but one of the things we want to kind of explain is if you undergo a HITRUST assessment, you are getting a validated assessment. By validated, Chris, it's effectively stating that you have assessed your scoring, and then an external assessor has validated your scoring, and then a quality assurance external assessor has reviewed that score, and finally HITRUST.
And HITRUST, they do the final.
So even if the score doesn't meet thresholds for certification or whatever percentage it is, it's still being validated because somebody has reviewed that score of 0 to 100 by each domain, by each requirement statement, and agreed with that based upon the test work that was completed.
Yes, and you'll get a report whether it be validated or certified at the conclusion of the HITRUST assessment, and it all depends on the scoring whether it's actually validated or certified.
Correct. And so every report, every HITRUST assessment is actually validated. If there's thresholds for the various levels of HITRUST assessments, and if you have exceed that specific threshold, then you actually receive a letter of certification from HITRUST. So you can have a validated assessment that also has a letter of certification because you've met a specific threshold in all domains to be able to have that. To have that. So it's an interesting concept, and it's just something that takes a little bit of clarification because it's very easy to confuse the terminology of validated and certified. And I think, Chris, we found that things are called one thing, and so this person calls it another. But it's want to be clarifying that any HITRUST assessment that is actually performed and goes through the external assessor review that is not a readiness type assessment is actually a validated assessment. Those organizations that meet the threshold in all the domains, as well as control references and requirement statements from a gap perspective, and meet the thresholds required, and we'll go over those in a future slide. But they will actually get a certification from HITRUST.
Yeah, exactly. And there's 3 types of assessments, right, John?
That's correct. So there's 3 types of assessments you can undergo, and I'll explain a little bit each of the assessments. But there's an Essentials E1 assessment, there's an Implemented I1 assessment, and there's a Risk-Based R2 assessment. So one of the things I'll kind of get into is each of these provides a varying level of assurance, and what that effectively means is each of the assessments defines a different set of the common security framework that has to be met. So the HITRUST E1 assessment, which is the Essentials assessment, provides what I would say is the lowest level of assurance over an organization. And the reason we say it's the lowest level of assurance is that it's based upon 44 foundational security controls. So there's actually 182 requirement statements, and this includes only 44 of those effectively. So it's not that it's specifically, it's just parsing down the common security framework to a smaller set of controls. And the reason for that is not, as we talk through this common security framework, Chris and I talked through it earlier, it's a vast framework. Am I correct, Chris?
It consists of various different frameworks. And like I said before, there's a maximum depending on how many other security frameworks you want to include. You can have a max of the 1900 requirement statements.
Correct. And so this assessment is built for organizations that startup companies and or smaller companies who may have a lower risk profile, and who are working through the maturity, developing more mature security and privacy controls. So those 44 foundational security controls are really this assessment is intended for that type of organization. And I don't think that from the perspective of us sitting here, I think this is actually a great assessment to start off with if you're moving through looking to eventually go through the full R2 assessment. But it's, it really says that as we talk through this, that there is an assessment out there for every organization, depending on what you're doing. And I think that that's important to say. So I don't want to downplay the fact that it does provide the lowest level of assurance, but that lowest level of assurance is only because the E1 pulls in the least amount of requirement statements necessary to still get some aspect of a HITRUST assessment. So it's valid for 1 year. One of the things you'll note as we go through this, there's an E1, an I1, and an R2. The E1, the number that is after the letter in the assessment defines how long it is good for. So you would have to do an E1 every year. And I1 is good for 1 year. There is a rapid certification, recertification. I'm going to get into that in the next slide. So the I1 HITRUST assessment provides a moderate level of assurance, and the I1 is, once again, a validated assessment. It's good for 1 year. There is a rapid recertification option for a second year, which allows for a substantially less testing and evaluation and assessment of the controls. So it wouldn't be a full reassessment of the 182 control requirements, but it would provide a second year certification. So it's a sort of a fast track certification. And this is suitable for what I would say mid-level organizations who have fairly robust information security controls and can meet the 182 requirement statements or are on the path to meet the 182 requirement statements. As we talked earlier about the maturity levels, and that was one of the definitions that Chris has, E1 and I1 speak only to whether a requirement statement has been implemented. The full R2 expects all 5 maturity levels, which includes policies being documented, procedures being documented, also being implemented, and then also a management and a measurement of the actual functioning of the controls that has to be done. So these just speak to whether the 182 control requirements have been implemented in your environment. Next is the R2. The R2 assessment, it's interesting to sit and talk about this via slide, but because it's such a vast, it's a risk-based assessment that is good for 2 years. It provides the highest level of assurance through HITRUST. And what that means is this will take the HITRUST common security framework, and you actually develop risk levels for each of the areas to allow you to tailor your organization's risk based upon the type of information that's in your environment. It also allows you to layer up to 40 other regulatory frameworks on top of it. So if your organization is required to be HIPAA compliant, there's various state regulatory requirements, and then the state of Massachusetts has one, the state of California, those can all be selected. And what it does is it actually, based upon that risk and those other regulatory frameworks, it builds out a list of requirement statements that are required to be met.
Yeah, exactly. And that can be a maximum of the 1900 that we had mentioned before for those requirement statements. And it can include PCI. There's various authoritative sources out there that HITRUST is incorporated into the common security framework.
And what this basically allows an organization to do, or what it does, is it allows you to assess your organization based upon the risks that you have, the risk of your environment against multiple regulatory frameworks, and then you assess each of the requirement statements, and you can also provide it. Actually, the HITRUST assessment in R2 provides reports on those assessments of your control requirements, also based upon those additional frameworks. So you can actually see what specific requirement statements fall into the additional frameworks and provide a report as to how you scored on that. So
exactly, yeah. And just kind of to get into those three, would you say, Josh, the E1 would be the easiest and the R2 would be the most difficult to implement?
I would agree with that completely. The R2 is certainly it's a 2 year, you only have to do it every 2 years, but the scoping, the risk assessment that must be performed, evaluated, in determining sort of what are our requirements in an implementation of doing a full R2 assessment, you really may struggle initially to even determine what you have to meet until you actually, layer in all your regulatory requirements and your various levels of risk. So in some ways it is challenging, because you may end up coming out of it with 400 requirement statements, or you could have 900 requirement statements. I think I remember correctly, HITRUST said the average R2 has, if I believe it was like 450 requirement statements in the average R2, if I recall correctly. And they average it together. It's, we aren't able to get specifics for each of the R2s, but yeah.
Yeah, and then each of those requirement statements would have a certain number of elements.
Correct.
That need to be implemented based on the control.
And there would have to be policies and procedures for those. There's no getting away from having to have a policy documented, a procedure document. It has to be implemented, and then you also must be measuring it and managing any compliance issues with that. So it's a very large undertaking.
Yeah.
So, and the E1 and the I1, they both provide a different level of assurance. However, they have their place, given that, and I think we would both say that it allows options for organizations to assess themselves against this framework. It's not an all or nothing. You have to go the R2. It allows you to work towards, you can get an E1, and then 2 years later, you may want to be getting an I1, and then working towards and developing the maturity of your IT security processes and controls till you can actually get to the R2 level. So,
yeah, it's a good way to put it. Okay, so getting into the HITRUST assessment timeline, there is a general timeline that you can follow for HITRUST. The first part would be the readiness assessment, which can take around 60 to 90 days. And as we said before, it's essentially looking through all the controls and making sure that you have them implemented, going through the scope, and looking at any gaps or corrective action plans. So HITRUST also recommends a remediation period of 60 days between implementing and the beginning of the assessment period. And then the assessment period is actually going to be 90 days. So this is actually where an external assessor would come in and test the evidence. So depending on whether it's an E1, an I1, or an R2, the assessment period will all be the same. It would essentially be the 90 days. And the quality assurance review, as Josh had kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, that's essentially 60 days. And there's actually a quality review that's performed by both the external assessor and by HITRUST. So there's multiple sets of eyes that are looking at the evidence for the requirement statements and elements. And after that would be actually when the final report would be issued based on the scoring and if it would be validated or certified. And that report would be actually issued by HITRUST.
So, HITRUST reporting. One of the things that we kind of wanted to cover was we've now talked through the background of HITRUST. We've also talked about the HITRUST Common Security Framework. We've also talked through the various types of assessments. What does a timeline for an assessment look like? And one of the things I think, I hope everybody took from that timeline that Chris just went through was the fact that you must plan ahead. Yeah. I mean, everything there takes time. I mean, you can pretty much add those dates up and get to 365 days pretty easily. So, these do not, plan ahead, do as much pre-assessment pre-assessment work as you can to help identify what, where your organization is, because, you can't just snap your fingers and be able to get an assessment that, you can, but you may not like the results of your assessment. And
even working backwards, like saying, correct. Hey, I need this report by this date. When should I start the readiness assessment? When should I schedule the actual assessment period with the external assessor? And then also having that buffer in there for the QA review.
Correct. So as far as the HITRUST reporting overview, so you've gone through your HITRUST assessment. We've talked about, and Chris talked in the timeline about an external assessor, then a quality assurance external assessor, and then also a HITRUST quality assurance review that occurs, and then a report being issued. So one of the things I want to make clear about HITRUST assessments is the reports are issued by HITRUST. HITRUST effectively is who provides the report on the assessment and your scoring. External assessors such as McKonly and Asbury, we actually work with clients to score and test their compliance with the controls that are then uploaded to, and the results of those tests and scoring is provided to HITRUST, who then determines if it's actually, if they agree with the scoring that has been provided by the external assessor. Same with the quality assurance. So it is sort of an interesting concept, because you think of our IT assurance practice, where we do SOC reports and various other assurance services where we provide opinions. It's a little different in that HITRUST provides the opinion. We're testing and in providing the support so that they can actually provide that report. I shouldn't say they provide an opinion. They provide an assessment of the scoring, and that is that hey, they validated that your scores are what they are. I don't want to make the comment that it's an opinion. So the report that you receive from HITRUST will include any remediation activities that are tracked via corrective action plans. So as an organization undergoes an assessment, areas where they may be deficient, they will receive there's corrective action plans that are required to be built in and put forth in the assessment. So, which is very, very, it's a component of understanding that when you do have a specific gap as defined by HITRUST, you do have to document that you did not meet this specific requirement statement, you did not meet the threshold level in this domain, and therefore you have to provide a corrective action plan on how you're going to move forward, and that corrective action plan does go into the report. So that is an interesting comment. So I do want to make sure that that's sort of understood, that it's just not, hey, your score was this. It's your score was this. Here's your areas of gaps in corrective action plans and what your plan is to go forward. As we said earlier, all the reports are validated. What we kind of say by that, the pre-assessments or readiness assessments are not validated, but the reports are validated in that the scores that are provided and the scores by each requirement statement, control reference, domain that are provided are actually gone through a quality control process, and there's a verification that that score is accurate based upon the test work that was done over that area. So in the reports, we talked about certification validation. Certification is done based upon scoring results for an E1, an I1, and an R2. And the certification is actually defined at the domain level. So we talked about the 19 domains. So it's interesting because you must meet a specific threshold at a domain. If there's a control reference or a requirement statement that doesn't meet a threshold, you may have to put a corrective action plan or an identified gap in. However, the actual certification is based upon the domain level score. So when they provide scoring thresholds, all the domains must meet the threshold. So you'll see in the next slide, I have a very colorful slide in here that the actual there's actually everything is scored 1 through 100 with I guess we could say 100 being perfect and not 1, but 0 through 100, and 0 being obviously not implemented at all, so or not in place at all. So when you actually do the scoring, you're scored on your I think as we look at this table that we have in here at the framework requirement statement level for an R2. If your requirement statements are great, each individual requirement statement is greater than a 70, you have no gaps. If one is 62 to 70, if one of your requirement statements scores at a 65, then you have a risk acceptance where you've actually kind of you're below the 70, but the no cap is required. You've accepted the risk related to that lower score. If you score less than 62 on a requirement statement, then you have a gap. You have a gap in your R2 assessment. Your R2 assessment is also scored at the control reference level. So the hierarchy of the framework, every requirement statement has a control reference, and every requirement statement has a domain that it's assigned to. So, if a specific control reference has 6 requirement statements associated with it, and you score 71 or higher on that control reference on those 6 requirement statements, there's no required cap. But if you're below 71 on an R2, you have a cap.
Yeah, and Josh, it's an average among the requirement statements and control references across the various control areas of the HITRUST, right? That's correct.
So there is a there is an absolute concept here of a defined score that says, you have a corrective action plan if you have less than a 71 in a specific control reference. And that, as Chris said, if there's 5 requirement statements, you average the score of those 5 requirement statements together for that control reference to determine if you're at 71 or not. So everything does get a quantitative score, and it feeds up, is a good way to put it. I mean, domain level, the domain level, every control or every requirement statement is assigned a domain. When you accumulate those requirement statements in a domain, if you score greater than a 70 on an R2, you get a certification. You have to do it for every domain, but it has to be all 19 domains have to be greater than 70. If you're between 62 and 70, certification is achieved. And you'll likely, we don't want to guarantee that, but likely if you're between a 62 to 70, you'll have a required corrective action plan that will actually go into the report on the assessment. Less than 62, you still have a validated assessment, but the scoring is validated, just not certified because it didn't meet the threshold. E1 and I1 scores are different or slightly different in that, there's for a requirement statement, if you're at 100, you have no gap. If you're at 75, for a requirement statement, you have to be at 75. You have a risk acceptance so that it's accepted that you may not score 100. If you score above a 75, you're okay. And then less than 75, you have a gap. At the control reference level, once again, it's 80 or higher to not have a corrective action plan. If it's less than 80, you have a corrective action plan. And then for the actual certification level for an I1 and an E1, you must be at 83 or higher. Within each domain, and your control, and your control reference, there's also a component here. If you're less than 83, you don't get the certification, but you have to be at 83 or higher, and if a control reference is less than 80, you can still get the certification for an I1 and E1. You will have a cap though for that specific control reference. So it's a unique kind of reporting structure for how it's quantitatively accumulated. What it basically means is when you have 182 requirement statements, Chris, with multiple elements in each, you're going through and scoring a lot of numeric values to the compliance with those controls.
Yeah, well, and that's the one nice part about it is, like you said, it is quantitative. So you can kind of see which areas are areas of improvement, what areas you're doing well in. So that's another good area, I guess, part of the HITRUST, depending on whether it's an R2, E1, or I1.
Great. So the HITRUST process for a validated report. The organization who wants to undergo the HITRUST assessment will select the type of assessment they want to go with, E1, I1, or R2. You define the scope of the assessment. Chris and I had already sort of talked about the scope, but the scope defines what the assessment is over. You define your applications that fall within that within that object. The databases, the operating systems and locations.
Yeah, so then I guess the first two, Josh, those two questions, those would be the actual client that is defining those, right?
That is correct.
So then the third one completes the assessment generated from the assessment object. That would also be the client.
Correct. Right? Upon completion of the scope, the assessment object is created, whether it's an E1, an I1, or an R2. It defines the requirement statements that you are required to meet. That's what that is. That is what the assessment is, and it provides them in a list, and you have to meet those assessment objects, and then you can start doing your assessment. So then the review and validation of the assessment to ensure the testing and scoring integrity, that is where the external assessor and potentially the assessing organization, depending on the level of staffing that they can have internal assessors, but they'll work with the external assessor and they'll determine the scoring and then verify the scoring through tests that are performed. I mean, and think of it as an internal control testing. Yeah, you pull samples, specific things such as that. So upon the completion of that external assessment and scoring, it goes to the first review, which goes to a quality assurance review that occurs from an external assessment quality assurance review, external assessor quality review. After that quality review, it goes to the quality assurance process review at HITRUST. So somebody at HITRUST will actually dedicate time to review all the work that has been done and the scoring over that work. They do not look at all the work. They actually specifically pull a sample of those specific areas, and they look at that sample to validate that they believe the scoring has been done in alignment with their quality control.
Yeah, exactly. So those next two, reviews and validates the assessment, ensure testing and scoring integrity, and completes a first quality review to validate the integrity of the testing and scoring. That would be both the external assessor, right, Josh?
That's correct. Yep, that is absolutely correct. That is where an external assessor such as McKonly Asbury would come in. We would come in and do the assessment of the testing and scoring, and then a quality assurance or quality assurance external assessor quality assurance would do their review as well. So, and then ultimately after HITRUST does their review, they issue the report with or without certification.
Yes.
It's validated, but it's with or without certification depending on the scoring that we went through. So.
Exactly.
So that is the process.
Yes, and those last two, just to clarify, Josh, those last two would be done by HITRUST.
That is correct.
Not by the external assessor or by the organization looking to get certified.
Absolutely, that is correct. All right, it's time for polling question number 4. Does your company currently undergo any compliance audits? Please select one of the answers: HIPAA, SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3, HITRUST, and another type of compliance audit, or no compliance audits. And you have about 30 to 45 seconds to answer the question. Few more seconds here. Get your answers in if you want your CPE credit.
We love those CPE, right?
Yep. All right, so the results of our polling question is about 15% undertake HIPAA compliance assessments audits, 20% of SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3. Nobody has the HITRUST. So we don't have anybody who's currently undergoing a HITRUST, and then 30% are other and 35% are not.
Yeah,
so,
that's good.
It's a good breakout of all areas there.
Oh yeah, exactly. So following our agenda, our last area would be benefits of the HITRUST assessments. So just some benefits would be the validated or certified report from HITRUST. The certification is actually one of the important things with HITRUST. It kind of sets you apart from other organizations. It can also help reduce cybersecurity insurance premiums and be also a third-party vendor risk management tool for your vendors. And it can also provide streamlined report processing and additional compliance reports.
I think one of the big components here is what the title of this slide is: why HITRUST.
Yeah. So
when we talk about the benefits, like why, I think we've gone through this, we've presented, sort of this very high level perspective of a HITRUST assessment and the various types of HITRUST assessments in this common security framework. And there's a lot of complexities to it, and there's a lot of its own vernacular that they use and things. And the question really becomes why. And, I think when we talk about the benefits here, Chris, we're really saying, like, why should an organization go through this? Yeah. I mean, and I think it's, there's, one of the couple of components here are, it provides a report on compliance with regulatory frameworks, and it's an assessment of where your organization standards are, with up to 40 regulatory frameworks that can be provided to third party, to customers who may be asking for it, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's very important that we, identify that there's a lot of benefits to these reports because of the ability to layer on so much compliance in one specific tool.
Yeah, exactly. And just another benefit of the HITRUST assessments, they're used, recommended, and accepted by 81% of hospitals and health systems, 83% of health plans, 75% of Fortune 5 or Fortune 200 or 20 companies, and then also the top 3 cloud providers.
It's correct. So in reality here, what this is effectively saying is not only did these organizations get HITRUST, I think that the term used, recommended, and accepted is covers many things, but hospitals, health plans, Fortune 20 companies, top 3 cloud providers, they're requiring, recommending, or accepting these as a compliance assessment for vendors, also for
business associates.
Business associates that they may be in, and for themselves, and they may be required to do it as part of, we found that in 2016, HITRUST identified almost all the major health insurance payers in the country were requiring HITRUST assessments of any of their service providers and vendors. So
yeah, and you can see that based on a kind of a general overview of the frameworks. I mean, there's several frameworks that can be incorporated, from HIPAA to PCI, so a lot of areas. And having HITRUST initially started in the healthcare area, it's definitely branched into other areas, but it still is primarily in that accepted by by hospitals, health plans, and so on.
Great. So do we, any questions that have come in, do we want to go ahead and answer, Chris?
Let's see here. Okay. Oh yeah, here's a good one. So what are some common challenges organizations face when undergoing a HITRUST assessment?
That's a very interesting question. As we sit here and have gone through all this, I'm kind of hopeful that as we went through it, I think, I think people would understand it's a complex, it's a complex framework and a complex assessment, though it's a framework that has been very widely used. So obviously it's not something that's very, is impossible to do, but, really most organizations encounter challenges when they're going down the road of the R2, and really it's due to the complexity of assessing and mitigating risks across their organization. So, one of the things is really trying to establish where their risks are, especially when you're doing an R2. As we said about the R2, it's a risk-based assessment. Well, a lot of organizations and a lot of individuals tend to overestimate risk, and in this case, the more assessment of risk you put to something, the more control required, the more requirement statements you have to meet. So really, one of the big challenges is the risk management process, especially when you're undergoing an R2. I mean, I don't necessarily want to say it's all for an R2, but that's a big challenge, because what it really intends is, a lot of times what happens is that it's just an over assessment of risk, and then it turns into an assessment that is just very difficult to meet. So, any other questions?
Let's see here.
Let me see if any more have come in.
Oh yeah, here's a good one, Josh. So in terms of scoping, resource allocation, and timeline management, how much time do you think a company should, if they're going to go down the HITRUST path, allocate? Because we did see kind of what the timeline, there's 365 days.
Yeah, the level of, I guess I would say the amount of time that needs to be allocated by an organization's IT department really depends on a couple of things, in my opinion. And it's the sophistication of their staffing, and also the maturity of their processes.
Yeah.
I hate to kind of say it that way, but if you are in an organization whose IT security and privacy processes and controls have not elevated to a specific level of maturity, then you will undergo a substantial level of effort to get a lot of these controls implemented. And at that point, it really becomes, do you have the bandwidth within your staff to be able to do that? So there's no easy answer to it's this many hours or that many hours. So
yeah. So if you have a dedicated IT person or someone on staff that is involved, that having that person involved can help make that process easier.
Great. All right, with that, I think we're going to go ahead and close the webinar. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. If you have any further questions regarding the HITRUST presentation today, please feel free to reach out to myself or Chris. Our team would be happy to assist in any questions or clarifications that you may need from today's webinar. A recording of today's presentation will be posted on our website and social media sites in a few days. For those of you who requested CPE and answered all of the polling questions, those certificates will be out within the next 2 weeks. I'd also like to provide a little reminder. On May 23rd, we are hosting an upcoming webinar on a manufacturing webinar from 2 to 3 p.m. And the webinar topic is advancing manufacturing with automation and AI. So let's hopefully feel free to sign up with that when the notification comes out on our website. And finally, there's 1 day left to register for our 10th annual Collaborate Leadership Conference, which will take place on May 2nd, which will again be held at the Penn Harris Hotel. Group registration discounts are still available and will be applied when you register 3 or more people from your organization at once. And you can find that on our website at www.macpas.com. All right, thanks again for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day.